Billions were on the table, yet none of it was going to the WTA. Brands weren't just ignoring Eala, they were turning their backs on the entire tour. A 19-year-old from the Philippines had become more financially valuable than a professional circuit built over 50 years. Not because of Grand Slam wins or a top ranking, but through something far more dangerous to the old guard: pure, unfiltered cultural pull. When the financial figures started coming out, the tennis world didn't just raise its eyebrows. It stopped breathing for a moment. Because what was happening wasn't a sponsorship story. It was a shift in power. A quiet corporate uprising wrapped in a tennis dress. And the WTA never saw it coming. Stick around, because by the time this ends, you'll see why the biggest battle in women's tennis right now isn't taking place on any court. There is a certain kind of athlete who outgrows their sport before the sport fully recognizes them. Muhammad Ali did it. Serena Williams did it. And now, whether the WTA establishment accepts it or not, Alexandria Yala is doing it on a level that has corporate boardrooms from Manila to Manhattan completely rewriting their marketing strategies. Philippines and shaped by strict discipline, then refined at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Yala brought something to professional tennis that no coaching manual teaches. She brought a story, a true cross-continental multi-generational story that connected with millions across Southeast Asia, Europe, and America all at once. That blend, the underdog roots, the elite European training, the magnetic personality, created what marketing insiders quietly call a major cultural alignment. And companies picked up on it long before the rankings did. By the time Yala was breaking through on the WTA tour, her social media following had already surpassed that of many higher-ranked players. Her Instagram engagement rates weren't just impressive for a tennis player, they were strong for any athlete in any sport, anywhere in the world. Brands were measuring real audience connection, not just follower numbers, but genuine emotional investment from actual communities. We're looking at numbers that made their analysts double-check the data. Sportswear companies, luxury watchmakers, tech giants, telecom firms with massive Southeast Asian customer bases, they weren't just curious. They were competing hard behind closed doors. Discussions moved from initial conversations into serious financial offers. And notably, these talks weren't going through the WTA's official partnership channels. They were going straight to Yala's team. That distinction mattered a great deal. The WTA operates on a traditional sports marketing model: centralized sponsorships, official tour partnerships, revenue systems built around the collective. That approach worked well for decades. But it was designed for a different era, an era before a single athlete could command more digital attention than the entire organization promoting her. Yala represented something the old model hadn't anticipated. A player whose individual brand pull was drawing sponsors away from the tour's orbit entirely. Not through defiance, not through conflict, but simply by existing and connecting with audiences on a level that the WTA's institutional voice couldn't compete with. Within tennis circles, whispers were growing. Agents for other players began hearing from brand partners that budget decisions were being reconsidered. Tournament sponsors started receiving quiet questions about renewal options. The money wasn't leaving women's tennis. It was concentrating around one distinct center of cultural pull. And that center had a name. That center had a backhand that could change conversations. And that center was just getting started. Ask yourself this: when was the last time a teenager made billion-dollar companies completely rethink their entire sports marketing approach? Because that moment has already arrived. Numbers have a way of getting out. They were never supposed to get out. The numbers being discussed in private conversations about Eala's individual sponsorship portfolio weren't small endorsement deals. These weren't the usual mid-tier agreements that professional tennis players outside the top 10 typically secure. What showed up in confidential term sheets and early-stage contracts reflected a level of financial commitment that placed a player still climbing the rankings in commercial discussions normally reserved for established Grand Slam winners. Reports coming from sports business circles pointed to individual brand offers that, when combined across multiple partnerships, added up to a total portfolio value estimated not in millions but in billions when stretched over multi-year deals. A telecom giant with deep Southeast Asian market reach was reportedly among the frontrunners. Several sportswear companies, recognizing the cultural influence she held across a large and growing consumer base, entered serious discussions. Technology brands looking for authentic ambassador voices in emerging markets saw her as irreplaceable. What made these offers unusual wasn't just the size, it was the structure. Brands weren't approaching her team asking how she fit within existing WTA partnership frameworks. They were building completely custom arrangements, creative collaborations, equity stakes, and sponsored content ventures. Long-term ambassador structures that treated her as a media brand rather than just an athlete endorser. One sports marketing analyst speaking to industry publications described the situation with striking bluntness. Brands had essentially decided that the emotional connection Yala had built with audiences was more effectively reached by going around the tour than through it. The WTA's official partnership framework, while valuable for reaching broad tennis fans, couldn't deliver the same deeply loyal, culturally specific communities that followed Yala personally. For the WTA, this reality carried serious financial consequences. When companies shift sponsorship money away from organizational deals toward individual athlete agreements outside the tour structure, the collective loses bargaining power. Other players lose exposure. Smaller tournaments lose revenue streams. The whole ecosystem feels the strain. And here's the part that really heightened the tension. Yala wasn't engineering this situation. She wasn't positioning herself against any institution. Her team was simply responding to extraordinary market demand with sound business judgment. That's not rebellion. That's business. But the consequences for the WTA were the same regardless of intent. Behind closed doors, tour executives were having uncomfortable conversations. How does an organization maintain sponsorship relevance when one of its own members has become a more attractive individual investment than the collective platform? How do you restructure commercial models built for a pre-social media era to accommodate an athlete whose personal audience overshadows the institution's reach? These weren't hypothetical strategic questions anymore. They demanded immediate answers, and the WTA, for reasons that will eventually become very public, seemed to be searching for those answers much too slowly. The billion-dollar question wasn't whether Yala deserved these offers. No one seriously disputed that. The question cutting through tennis boardrooms was far more unsettling. Had the WTA already lost the commercial narrative, and if so, could they ever truly get it back? Silence during moments of systemic crisis is never truly silent. It says everything. While brand negotiations around Yala were heating up and sports business media was starting to connect the dots publicly, the WTA's official communication channels remained notably quiet. No formal acknowledgement, no strategic positioning, no clear attempt to reframe the commercial conversation on their own terms, just institutional silence at the very moment when decisive action was most needed. And that silence was damaging. In today's media landscape, an organization's failure to control its own story doesn't just create a void. It hands the microphone to everyone else. Tennis journalists, sports marketing analysts, fan communities across multiple continents, and competing sports organizations all rushed to fill the interpretive gap the WTA had left open. The story taking shape in their absence wasn't a favorable one. It portrayed a governing body caught completely off guard by a shift that, in hindsight, had been visible for years. The underlying structural reasons for this slow response were complex. The WTA operates across multiple jurisdictions, balancing competing interests from players, tournaments, broadcasters, and long-standing corporate partners all at the same time. Decision-making within that framework moves slowly under normal circumstances, because slowness signals responsible governance. But the conditions surrounding Yala's commercial rise were anything but normal. Speed was essential. Adaptation was critical. And speed wasn't coming. Meanwhile, individual sponsors growing uneasy with the WTA's strategic direction began having conversations that months earlier would have seemed unthinkable. Brands that had maintained stable, mutually beneficial tour partnerships for years were suddenly asking basic questions about return on investment. Were WTA-associated platforms still reaching the audiences brands cared about most? Or had those audiences migrated to follow individual athletes, unique stories, and specific cultural moments outside institutional channels entirely? The answers those brands were finding internally were deeply uncomfortable for tour leadership. Digital analytics don't negotiate. Audience migration data doesn't honor historical relationships. And the overwhelming conclusion from many independent commercial evaluations was the same. The WTA's ability to reach certain high-value audience groups had noticeably weakened. And while Yala's personal platforms were growing, players across the tour were starting to feel the downstream effects. Discussions with potential personal sponsors were shifting. Brand representatives who used to mention WTA partnership alignment as a positive signal were now bringing it up less often, or framing it with caveats that hadn't existed before. The institutional stamp of approval that once boosted individual player commercial value was losing some of its pull. Veteran players speaking anonymously to sports journalists expressed real frustration. They had spent their careers building the WTA's collective commercial reputation. The thought that institutional silence during a pivotal moment could potentially undo years of shared effort felt to many like a serious failure of leadership, and still, officially, nothing was said. The WTA's communication void wasn't just a public relations mistake. It was a message to every corporate partner currently assessing their ties to women's tennis that the organization either lacked the awareness or the resolve to manage its own evolution. For sponsors used to working with progressive, strategically clear organizations, that message carried significant weight. Every day of institutional silence came with a real cost, and the bill was adding up fast. When companies start quietly adjusting their financial commitments, the term they use is never withdrawal. The language is always gentler. Strategic reallocation. Portfolio review. Shifting investment priorities. But beneath the polished corporate language, the meaning is the same. The money is shifting. And in women's tennis, it started shifting at an alarming speed. The departures didn't announce themselves with any fanfare. That's never how institutional sponsorship erosion works. It happens through renewal discussions that never reach a decision, through option clauses that lapse without being exercised, through partnership agreements that simply aren't renewed with the same enthusiasm or at the same financial levels as before. Gradually, then all at once, the commercial foundation started showing cracks. Several brands with established WTA ties began redirecting sizable portions of their sports marketing budgets toward individual athlete deals outside the tour framework. The logic behind these moves was simple, and from a purely commercial standpoint, completely reasonable. Audience engagement numbers around specific players, Yala being the most striking example, but not the only one, consistently beat the tour's own placement data. For brands measuring every marketing dollar against trackable audience results, the decision wasn't difficult. The tournament circuit felt this right away. Smaller WTA events, which rely far more on sponsorship money than broadcast revenue, started operating with tighter budgets. Prize money conversations became noticeably more complicated. The operational framework supporting hundreds of players across the professional tour, the athletes who would never command individual billion-dollar deals, but who formed the competitive foundation that made elite tennis possible, began feeling real pressure. This side of the fallout rarely got much public attention. The headline story was all about Yala's remarkable commercial rise. The quieter, more significant tale was what her gravitational pull was costing the players who would never benefit from it directly. A mid-ranked player competing in the lower tiers of WTA events doesn't gain anything from Yala's sponsorship negotiations. But she loses everything if those deals divert funding away from the collective system that supports her career. Several prominent voices within the tennis community started raising this issue publicly. The discussion wasn't framed as hostility toward Yala personally. Almost everyone agreed that the situation wasn't something she created or something she was responsible for. The frustration was aimed at structural gaps in the sports commercial framework, and at organizational leaders who appeared unprepared to adjust. Sports economists analyzing the situation noted a troubling similarity to patterns that had already disrupted other professional leagues. When an individual athlete's commercial value far exceeds the institution's brand strength, revenue distribution within the sport becomes fundamentally uneven. The athletes with the biggest personal profiles capture an outsized share of the value. Everyone else faces growing financial uncertainty. The middle tier of competition, which is vital for any sport's long-term viability, becomes economically fragile.